Hello, my name is Megan Bleck, and today I'll be talking about the public education system in the United States. More specifically, I'll be exploring how compulsory education laws became an accepted idea of American life. The title of my paper is The Transformation of American Educational Values, Public Opinion as the Catalyst of Change. Just as my title has stayed the same, my thesis has stayed relatively the same as well, although I was able to make it much more concise as last time it was very lengthy. My thesis is now, because of societal forces beyond the control of the average citizen, compulsory education laws in the United States were not initially followed or enforceable. And it was not until the majority of the American public supported the idea of compulsory education that it became the accepted standard. This is just a summary of the thesis that I had written and used in my last presentation, but again, this one gets more directly to the point in a much shorter time frame. I chose this argument because after reading and sorting through the research from the time period that I'd chosen to study, which was the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century, it became clear that something was keeping children from attending school. And more notably, whatever forces were at work seemed to be specifically keeping lower and working class children from going to school, which predominantly were the children of minorities and immigrants. These were also the people in society that industrialization had turned into low-skilled factory workers with little compensation. Within my paper, I explore how the United States and general sentiments about compulsory education seem to have gone from those of ambivalence to that of acceptance in about 50 or so years, from approximately 1850 to 1900. Instilling compulsory education was not a completely new concept in 1852, when the United States saw its first state compulsory law come out of Massachusetts. The state was simply following the precedent that the colony had set in 1642 and 1647, with the laws that made it a requirement for parents to bring up their children in a way that would make them upstanding Puritan Christians that contributed to society. Now, these laws were written as a way to formally incorporate the Puritan belief that the family unit was responsible for creating a well-rounded citizen. This in itself points to the fact that people had to agree that a basic education of some sort was what was best for children for it to be a value of theirs in the first place. This responsibility made it so parents had to be the teacher, or they had to find others that they thought were suitable enough to teach their children. And the teaching didn't even just go on in classrooms like we might typically think. In a Puritan lifestyle, the teachings were taking your son or daughter, or probably most likely your son, out to teach him how to chop the firewood. It would be mom teaching the daughters how to sew a garment, how to cook the meal. Those were the kinds of education type things that they also were thinking of when they thought about learning how to read the Bible and being able to write their biblical quotes as well. But this foundation exemplifies the bigger picture of what happens 200 years later when compulsory education laws began to resurface. However, it was not until American sentiment had shifted in support of these compulsory education laws that we see the attendance begin to rise. And we do see the attendance rise at the end of the 19th century. Other historians point to the rise in technology and governmental agencies as to what caused the shift we see in the amount and the demographics of children that populated schoolyards. They also point to major philosophers of the time like John Dewey and Horace Mann, who changed education by reevaluating the way that we look at children and their learning process. They were both proponents of a child-centered approach, and these were the men that brought European kindergartens to the United States. And kindergartens at that time were predominantly focused on actually helping the lower and middle class students rise in the ranks of school systems. That's how they were being used in Europe anyways. And so when they were brought over to America at first, because of the societal standards that were in place, they weren't readily acceptable because of the way that American life conducted itself. While these factors definitely contributed to the willingness of Americans to send their children to school, there were other societal factors such as industrialization, which also factored into the reason why parents couldn't send their children to kindergartens even if they wanted to. Immigration and religion also played a role in the shifting sentiments of American support of compulsory education at this time as well. But starting with industrialization, in terms of business and to an extent the government, they saw the newly forming public education system as a means to create a workforce that was reliable and hardworking, because the formerly agrarian workers needed to be more focused when working in a manufacturing setting. Before, when they were working in an agrarian setting, it was a more laid back, they were outdoors, they weren't having to do a methodical thing over and over and over again that would possibly either endanger their whole life or maim a limb. In a factory setting, those last two things were definitely contributing factors to why governments and business leaders alike wanted safety procedures, wanted a workforce that was trained in a factory setting style or would be able to transition into one of those settings easily, because they wanted to cut down on the losses that they were seeing by losing workers to injuries and death. And from them just not taking the safety precautions and procedures seriously because, in their old jobs, maybe they didn't have to be. For a long time before child labor laws began going into effect, it was no secret that children were also being utilized by business leaders as workers. For working class families, it meant that they could pay their bills and eat for the week by sending their children to work instead of school. So these were not the children that you would be finding in the one-room schoolhouses that did exist in some settings or being tutored, because these children were the ones that were being sent to work because their families depended on it for survival. In 1832 and then revised in 1842, however, Massachusetts set the stage for curbing the ills of society when they enacted a child labor law. And then in 1842, they added more provisions to it to ensure that children would be entitled to and would be able to attend school for a set amount of time, depending on the age. In fact, this law made schooling a requirement in order to work in the first place. However, the intent of the law might have been very good, but the law was actually highly unenforceable because the lack of technology and a lack of financing for personnel to ensure that the law was even being followed. And so children in turn would be able to say that they were going to school even if they weren't, or vice versa. A factory could say that they knew a child was going to work even if they knew that they weren't. But it is important to note that this requirement set down by this law, even if not followed or enforced, started the ball rolling for public sentiment to switch to that of being in support of mandated schooling. In the modern age, because of technology and social media, it can take as little as a day for something to become a trend or an idea that people support. But in the past, it took much longer for these kinds of ideas to travel from coast to coast and permeate the values and beliefs that people had already held. It makes sense that then Americans from all walks of life would be hesitant to support these compulsory education laws. It was still a relatively new concept, and educating children had largely in the past been left up to the parent. So people were hesitant to trust whether the government really had the best intentions at heart for them and their children. Immigration is also another theme present throughout this period and affected compulsory education and the support Americans had for it in a variety of ways. Immigrants were flooding the U.S. from all walks of life, and in 1870, 3 million immigrants had made their way to America, and by 1890, there were more than 9 million first-generation immigrants residing in the U.S. They brought with them distinct cultures, values, and religions, which frightened some Americans because of the differences that they highlighted in comparison with their own. Because of this fear, whether conscious or not, Americans were ready to accept any proposed solution to what they deemed the immigrant problem. The solution was called Americanization, and it wasn't only utilized in the school system, but was very influential there because children are still very impressionable, which makes it a lot easier to erase and replace those values, those languages, and their culture with that of another, and in this case, America's. Simultaneously, the government was introducing and trying to instill a new American value of compulsory education while also instilling the other beliefs that make up American culture. A hard task for anyone to accomplish, but especially hard to accomplish when the American people were already hesitant of accepting the compulsory education. At this point in time, The U.S. education prior to all of this legislation was predominantly ran by religious and charitable institutions. These were the institutions that Americans had trusted to educate their children, especially since they could still taste the bitterness of past wrongs from previous governments and politicians. However, when it came down to whether Americans feared their own government or immigrants more, Americans went with the evil that they knew over the one that they didn't and embraced Americanization policy. They sent their own children to school and hoped that in turn that meant that immigrants would send their own children to school and the assimilation process would begin. Immigrants embraced the policy even if they didn't quite understand the actual intent because they wanted better for themselves and therefore their children. They saw the opportunity that education could provide, even if it meant that their children might be losing some of their original values and cultures. For these reasons, it is clear that Americans, new and old alike, were shifting their view of education. And despite this erasure of culture, immigrants were able to preserve bits of their home countries by way of religion. And because of the U.S.'s First Amendment, most immigrants felt free to practice their different faiths openly. However, even though the U.S. has the First Amendment and officially is a secular state, Protestant Christian values can be found in many institutions, laws, and regulations around the nation. Remembering that Americans lived in small communities spread out from one another over distances prior to mass urbanization, and even after, it makes sense that these areas would be populated with like-minded individuals or people who valued the same things and even went to the same churches. These same Protestant-leaning people would be the legislators and educators, and then in turn would send their children that would be the pupils in the classrooms. So inevitably, this is how American culture came to echo this Protestant sentiment, with the school system not being an exception. Many Americans wanted their Protestant religion to rid immigrants and others of their vagrant ways, as one preacher said in a pamphlet published in 1854, and they saw how compulsory education could succeed in that endeavor. However, not all Americans and immigrants subscribed to a Protestant Christianity, so Catholics and Jews alike, who had already had their own schools, began creating more to fill the needs of the growing population. The fact that these religious institutions ran by ordinary people were setting up their own schools shows that the general sentiments of those residing within America were surely shifting to the acceptance of compulsory education and the belief that educating children was important. These weren't public schools that were being set up by, Catholics and Jewish people. They were setting up their own private schools, but were also still following the state laws that had been enacted in various different territories and states in regards to the set amount of weeks that students should be going to school, the ages that children should be going to school and ending school at, the different grade levels, how to divide them, all these different expectations that were being set down by the different state departments of education that were being set up, along with all the different laws that were coming out in regards to different schools in general, how many schools need to be provided in a certain area, and things of that nature. And so the fact that these private institutions were following a public mandate without being specifically told that they needed to really shows that regular, ordinary people, Americans and immigrants alike, were willing and wanted to educate their children, that they saw the value in it. They saw that having an educated child didn't only open up doors for that child, but it opened up doors for them as well. And so as general opinion swayed, we see that governmental institutions begin to follow suit with the public. The federal government established the first Department of Education in 1867, so earlier on in this time period that I was looking at. But by 1900, so in less than 40 years, 32 states and territories had compulsory education laws as well as their own departments of education. This increase in governmental education institution laws would not have been able to succeed without the support of everyday Americans. And as we see this, the attendance grew as well. We see that in as little as 30 years from about 1860 or 1850, there was only 47% of all the students or children of student age attending school in the United States, but by 1900, or by 1920 actually, we see that 64.3% of all school-aged children were attending, which was a huge jump, especially when we see that immigrants went from in 1850 making up only about 0.1% of those students that were going. We see also that they switch to making up about 40% of the school attendance by the time 1920 rolls around as well. And so that means that not only were regular, already American citizens adopting this new idea about compulsory education, but we see that immigrants themselves were taking on these values and also maybe supporting them even more so than Americans, because they saw the added value a little more because of the need for incorporating all of these American values that they didn't have yet. Anyways, so thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will try and respond to them to the best of my ability. Have a great day. Thank you.